G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Welcome back to the Wealth and Wisdom podcast. I'm Ben Law and I'm your host. Today we've got a special guest joining us, Andrew Roberts. Andrew's not only a renowned business coach, but also one of the original founders of the Farm Owners Academy and the Profitable Farmers podcast. With countless topics to choose from, we've selected what we believe is the most critical components in a multi-generational family's success, both on and off farm. We'll unravel the transformative potential of defining your family values and documenting a compelling family mission that acts as a guiding compass for your family right now, as well as for generations to come. You might be thinking that values and a family mission can't be that important, but let me tell you, ignore them at your peril. I've witnessed firsthand the positive impact of shared values and a strong family mission can have. They not only protect family wealth, but also strengthen family bonds, and most importantly, create and preserve family harmony. Aligning values and purpose often acts as a rocket fuel for your family business and can provide a remedy for resolving conflict both now and potentially in the future. So without further delay, welcome Andrew.
It's great to be here, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and now I've been really looking forward to this for the last, month or so since we've had it booked in. I think we're going to have a great conversation today. Now, Andrew, before we get kicked off, can you give us a bit of a brief background on yourself and why you're sitting here across from me today?
Mate, I grew up on a farm in New South Wales, so I'm very familiar with living in an agricultural farming family. But I got into the world of coaching, business coaching at the age of 22, so I was very young. So my experience has been working with business owners. I originally got into coaching to learn business because I always had in my head that one day I wanted to run a business, and I thought, what a great way to learn business, actually mentoring and coaching others. And it's actually very true. I didn't realize after the first few years that was going to be my passion and my business. So I've stuck with that for 24 years, lots of experience in the ag space. So I've worked with a number of companies in agriculture and co-founded Farm Owners Academy. But 24 years has just opened my eyes up into why do some businesses work and why do some not work. And yeah, I love business, passionate about it. It's a game and I really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's interesting. During my whole 20 years as a financial advisor, I was fascinated why you could have some families, side by side even, and they can have the same resources, the same opportunity, and some thrive and some fail.
Yeah. And
it was just really interesting to me. So I went on this lifelong journey of being like an annoying little toddler saying to all these things, why? So yeah. I think we're probably on the same journey there.
Oh, absolutely, mate. It's a never-ending journey. I've been doing it for 24 years and I still feel there's so much more for me to learn. But this is why I love coaching, because you're just constantly learning and growing.
So like you said, Andrew, you've been coaching for most of your adult life, especially in the ag space. Today, we're going to be starting to talk about, how important values are in a family,
yes,
and also having a sort of a unified mission of where we're going with the family business, in the ag space. And, when I have this conversation with successful producers about, worrying about values and mission and where you're going, the common response I get is, Ben, I'm flat out. I've got millions of jobs need my attention. I've got so little time. What the bloody hell should I give two hoots about values and mission when it comes to the family? And, they would say to me, wouldn't my time be better used working out and getting through all the outstanding jobs on the farm? Yeah. Do you think that's right?
Mate, it's such a typical response, and everyone's busy, but slowing down to speed up, this is what getting your values in order is all about. So slowing down, putting these things in place will just save a significant headache, will remove a lot of mistakes in the future, but will just make your business a lot more efficient. Put the structure in place, alignment, happier team members. So there's a number of benefits, but I can understand why people do think it's wishy-washy or they may feel they don't have time for it.
Yeah, and look, to be frank, early on in my career, I thought exactly that. I remember I was working for larger scale organisations in the financial advice space, and they'd come in and they'd say, "Yeah, we're going to talk about values and mission and vision."
Yeah.
And it just sent me straight away to sleep. I'm like, this is a complete waste of time. But over time, I started to, I spent 20 years myself in the ag space, and what I started to notice is successful people sort of had some common threads into what they did. And what I found is the people that seemed to be really successful had really strong values.
Yep.
And they had a really clear vision of where they wanted to go in the future. Have you found that in the coaching space yourself, mate?
Well, this is similar to you. I would have thought this was fluffy once upon a time, and I wouldn't have put energy to it. And success leaves clues. And I've been very lucky over my time to work with companies that have done extremely well. And I've learned more from them than they would have from me. So, and this is one of the beautiful things about coaching for 24 years is you get to see, well, why is it that this business over here is just doing so well and this one over here is doing poorly? And the ones that are doing well are nailing this stuff. They've got it right. It's documented. The whole team are aligned to it. And they run their business by this. They hire on values. They fire on values. They put it front of mind. And so I started seeing the impact of getting this stuff right and then realizing, wow, every business would benefit from doing this. It just tightens structure and brings so many benefits from just putting it in place. So like you, I was skeptical, but now I would never run a business or work with a client that's not working on this stuff.
So how does someone start to work out what their values are?
Yeah. Really good question. So I like to look at it. Firstly, we have personal values. All of us have things that are important to us. And I know in my first year of business, a lot of my mentors told me, Andrew, sacrifice parties and just go all in that first year, work your bum off. But because I didn't adhere to one of my values, which was social activity, catching up with mates, I felt very miserable after that 12 months. So I sacrificed a personal value, if you like, for business success, but felt very miserable. So I realized that, wow, I can't sacrifice that. So we've all got personal values. And the interesting thing is all of us are slightly different with what we value personally. So what's important for me might not be important for you. And there's no right or wrong. And what's important for me could be quite different to what's important for my brother. And I know when I was a kid, I used to always think that my brother was wrong. And he should be more like me. And this caused a lot of fighting between us. And only as I started unraveling values, I realized we're just different. I've actually been able to find a lot more acceptance for him, just realizing that what he values is different to what I value. And so it's just important to look at that. So personal value is what's important to me. That's a personal value. So some people might value hard work, wealth creation, whatever. You might have a different person that values holidays and time with friends and health, fitness. And so that's the first thing to look at, personal values. And then we go up another line, which is what's important to the business. And this is now business values. And we actually call them standards at Farm Owners Academy because it's what is the standards that we want our team to align to? And it's almost the rules. It almost governs the rules of how you want the business to run. And they're very powerful. To come up with a set of core values, I like to have no more than 5, and often it can be represented by a word. So you might have the word integrity, okay, as one of your core values, but it's very important to articulate, well, what do we mean by that? So in our business, integrity would be we do what we say we do. We get back to people within 24 hours. If we say we're going to do something, we're going to get it done. Okay, so that's a clearly defined value that we can then make sure that in a farming business, you've got the family are aligned to that value. And it can't be a value that's no one's playing by. You just make it up because you want it. It's got to be a value that's called permission to play, which is a false value. It's got to be something that, this really represents our business. This really represents how we want people to play. And the beautiful thing is you can fire people on these and you can hire people on these. So I'm happy to go into a bit more depth, but it's so important because, just to give you another one, you might have accountability, again, which is doing what we say we're going to do. It could be similar to integrity, or you could have the value of hard work. These are okay. So sitting down with your family and just discussing, what is it that's going to represent our business? It really does need to come from the top, really needs to come from the key leaders of the business. And the key leaders of the business have to at times make decisions if the people, including their family, are aligned to these values. And sometimes that might open up a tough conversation where you might have a child coming back into the business that's not aligned to those values. And that's tough. That's going to create a really interesting dynamic. There's two things to do here. It's number one, either how do I align that child to these values? How do we train them, or how do we instill these? Or second thing is, look, there's not a position for you in this organisation, because that's just going to cause frustration for both parties. And it doesn't mean that child or sibling's wrong. That's a really important point, because it's easy to basically say, oh, I don't like them because they're not aligned to my values. But it's not true. It's like, how do I accept them for being different and realise that they might be happier in a culture that's more aligned to their values, if that makes sense. So values govern culture. And just to take a step back here, we've been doing a lot of work on this recently, and I'm a huge believer in, before you even do the values, getting the structure, the organisational structure of your business right. So they call it structure first, people second. So getting the organisational structure right, which is who's going to sit at the CEO level, who's going to sit at head of marketing, head of operations. And then the second part is looking at the team and ensuring that you've got the people with aligned values. Once you've actually clarified what the company values are, 4 or 5 of them, have we got people in alignment with them? And then putting them into the relevant seats and asking the question, do they get it? And this is straight out of the book Traction. Do they get this job? Do they really understand how to do this job well? Do they want this job? Do they really have a passion for it? And do they have capacity for it? And so for me, those 3 things are more important than values when you're putting someone into a role. Because if you might have a child coming back into your farm that's a gifted communicator, but not great at farm work on the land, because they haven't got they might be aligned to your values, but you're putting them into a job role where they're terrible, if that makes sense. So it's very important to make sure that they get it, they want it, capacity, and then they also align to the company values. And so if you're reviewing anyone in your organisation, they have to have a tick next to GWC, get it, want it, capacity, and you're really aiming to align them at a minimum 80% to the values, because values can also be trained.
And so I'm guessing then that values would be really important to be transitioned to the next generation, working out your core family values, transitioning it to the next generation as well as you possibly can.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the fastest way to help children particularly learn values is for you to be living them, number one. It's no good having a value of integrity if you're not keeping your word. So there's a great saying that the fish stinks from the head down. A lot of challenges can start at the top. But in terms of instilling them down through the family, yes, but there's still maybe a child. I've got a brother who I'm super close with now, but when we were younger, he was different. We just wanted different things. We valued different things. We've got different mates. He wants different things in his life. I've always valued growth and working on myself and improvement. It's not an interest for him. So it wouldn't matter how much you try to drum into him that value, he may never get it. He may never want it. So you got to understand that you can't force someone onto your values. You can't. You can demonstrate them, but you can certainly define them and ensure that you want the family to play by it. But sometimes they might be just not aligned to that. And I don't see that being a problem.
But you've just got to be aware that that's the issue and that there are potential opportunities and consequences with those facts.
Yeah, this is why structure first, people second. And the way I look at it in family-run farms is the shareholders sit right up the top, the owners of the business. The CEO reports up to the shareholders, and then the CEO overlooks all the other roles. Now, if you've got a shareholder who's an owner of the business, but it's also a worker in that business, they have to play by the rules of the business, in my opinion, if you want a successful company, which means that they have to abide by the standards and the culture and the values that's the CEO or the leadership team put in place that are agreed on. Because if that person's making the assumption, well, I'm an owner, but I'm not prepared to play by these standards, these rules, they should be treated like a typical employee. I think there's a governance that if it's not put in place, there's a great saying, if I don't set the rules, my team will make them up. But we find that when there's agreements on these boundaries, these values, the organisational structure, there's an agreement on, right, this is the roles you've got, but these are the values we want you to play by. And I'll come back and talk a bit more because it's all good and well to come up with a value, but you've got to then embed it into the culture. And I'll talk about how to do that shortly. But then really, when there's reviews done on these team members, they should be reviewed on how in alignment are you to GWC, how in alignment are you to get at one capacity, how in alignment are you to our company values. And if they're not in alignment, go back to the integrity one, they might have said a few times they'd do something, but it didn't happen, or accountability, they're not following through. Then step number one is, how do I train them on how to be better at this? And then if after that it fails, you have to move them on. There's a great saying, you have to make a decision. You have to remove ego, past beliefs, and you have to make decisions for the greater good of the company going forward. And we've witnessed this a lot at Farm Owners Academy, where we've got a family where brothers are at each other's neck because they've just got different values. But they get stuck in you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. So that there's conflict, right? Massive conflict, or a brother-in-law, sister-in-law could be involved here. So there's this massive conflict, and what we've helped them work out that this is not going to work, and it's tough because then they have to come up with what's the solution from here, and sometimes it's a matter of splitting the businesses up or working out a way to get the sibling that's not wanting to be there out or whatever it is. But if these things are left festering, it's a horrible place to be. If you've got a sibling in a company that's not that you might have, let's say you got 3 brothers, I'm making this up, but 2 might be fully aligned and one's not, it's going to be frustrating for the 2 and it's going to be very frustrating for the 1. So sometimes you're better off making that tough decision of this, and there's nothing personal. It's just we have to let this person go because they're not aligned to the company values. And if you're not hiring and firing on company values, then you're, I think, creating a lot of conflict. There's possible conflict in farm, fighting, disagreeing, mistakes being made, frustration. This is what caused a lot of this grief. Resentments. There's an example right now that we're witnessing with 2 family members valuing 2 different things. One of them very driven, very hungry for success. The other one's just going through cancer and wants to slow down, but it's causing massive resentment and tension. And we're trying to take the heat out of it by saying there's nothing personal going on here. You guys just value different things. When you make it personal, when you think that the other sibling should be more like you.
Well, I think this is a really important point. If I can just jump in here, Andrew, is I see more friction intergenerationally normally. And yes, absolutely. I mean, in my family, I've seen the siblings not getting along and the fractures that can happen there. But I see a lot of this happen between parents and viewing the children coming through to be able to come into the business. If you have 3 children, they're generally going to be all different personalities. Yeah. And for mum and dad to get where they might be incredibly driven, hardworking, and then they see the next generation coming through and all of a sudden they see some really different values, maybe a different work ethic value. They're wanting to do things differently. They're wanting to see the world. They're wanting to spend more time with family. And I remember a great example was I did a session with a family not too long ago, and we talked about values in the family, trying to align everyone. And mum and dad were, or probably more dad, was all about the hard work. You sacrifice everything for the hard work. That's what we're doing. That was his number one value. And one of the sons said, look, I've come to realize I've just had a child in the last couple of years, and I think happiness and family is my number one value.
Bingo.
And you could see this friction between dad going, yeah, look, that's all well and good, son, but, the cattle got to be mustered. There's work to be done. And so there was this original friction between the two of them as he's backing off saying, I want to spend more time with family, and dad saying, no, there's more work to be done. And so once you worked through and realized what that meant to each other, you're able to disperse a lot of that friction when dad understood where the son was coming from and son understood where the dad was coming from. And it was quite interesting because the son was saying, I want to spend more time with my child now that he's been born. Dad wanted to spend more time with his horses, training horses and doing his horse work. Yeah. And so it was like they were both coming from the same spot. They were both wanting the same things, just slightly differently, but they couldn't communicate that.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode.
But this is huge, what you've just shared, because you have an opportunity to understand that person's value system. I was sharing with you before this chat a mate of mine whose parents grew up in a pub. Both of them died very young. So, I think late 50s, maybe early 60s. And so he saw them working their backsides off and both of them dying young. Can you see that the impact that's had on him is, well, why am I going to work so hard? What's the point? So he's got a different value system because of witnessing something that his parents did that didn't pan out, of course. And so that can influence people's this is very important because values change. And you're right, this younger generation are possibly seeing things very differently to what we see things at or our parents. It doesn't mean they're wrong. It's easy to get caught in the trap. I'm right, you're wrong. What you said's on the money. If you can sit down and actually seek first to understand before being understood. And I think it's the younger generation need to really also take the time to understand the older generation. I mean, an issue just to understand why have they, that hard work's in their bones. It's been there forever. And if you look at the older generation as well, Ben, what starts happening is they want to retain the wealth. The younger generation often will come in and want to be a bit riskier, right? So the older generation are probably less risk averse. The younger generation are more risk averse. So this can create a little bit of conflict because the older generation are like, well, hang on, we've built it up. Let's not lose it. Whereas the younger generation are, let's push ahead.
I want my go.
Dad,
Mum, you had your go. When's my turn to have a go to be able to push this? And they want to prove themselves out there in the marketplace, whereas Mum and Dad are more worried about that protection of the wealth and that it's going to be sustained through the generations because they're very aware of the old saying, it takes 2 generations to build it and 1 to lose it.
Yes.
So they're hypersensitive in my experience to, if you don't do what we've done to be successful son, daughter or sons and daughters, you're going to be the statistic.
Yeah.
Whereas the next generation is not worried about that. They're like, what is this 2 to make it, 1 to break it? I just want to have a go. Like I want to kick some goals here.
Yeah. And I can understand that desire. And just to share a quick story with you, we had a conflict going on like this with a mother and father and 2 sons working on the farm. Mum and Dad didn't want to let go the control, but the younger kids were driven, motivated. Come on, give us a go. This friction going on. Eventually, the mum and dad did realise that they did want to slow down and everything, but they were very nervous. They had all this fear, okay? There's a fear governed with handing it over. But eventually they decided to give it a go and they let the kids step up and start making the decisions. And the kids have tripled that business. These are good quality kids. I mean, they've got the right values to run that. It's not like they're going to It's not like they want to have a go and sit on their hands. These guys are having a go and working hard.
And there's a difference there, and it's identifying in your children whether there is a drive to do better or just a drive to get.
Yes.
We just want something. And
Yes.
what I've found in the younger generation is up to age 30, generally most kids, the friction's coming, or I say kids, they're adults, but between 20 and 30 is most of them aren't driven to own anything at this stage.
No.
They're just driven to have a go. Like I want to have autonomy. I want to be starting to make some decisions. I want to be starting having a bit of control over things.
Yep.
Ownership of cattle, machinery, land comes generally later, is my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to come back to what you just said, because we've got another business where you've got one of the brothers that's really driven and wants to get ahead and wants to work on the business and grow it, and his brother just wants to farm. But that's an incredible dynamic.
That's awesome. That can be a great result, can't it?
Very good result. So we've got one of them working on the business for a couple of days a week. So he's pulled back on the farm work, but that works, growing the business exponentially, and his brother's heading up the farm. And this is the power of structure first, people second. So you might find some kids just want to farm, others want to have a crack. You get all of these dynamics, but I will say that there's nothing more demotivating for a driven kid who's not given the chance to have some form of crack, you know? And I mean, this is what I love, what you're doing, Ben, with the coaching and mentoring. The best thing that kid could do is have the mentoring and the right environment around him that's supporting that person on the journey, so they get the skills to minimize risk. So there's confidence from the parents that they're not going to be making silly decisions, because it's not about risking, okay? It's about mitigating risk but growing the business.
And as we get older, like I'm 46 now, so I used to be considering myself in the younger generation, but I think it's pretty squarely now. I'm probably not. And so what happens is over time is our risk tolerance changes, as you mentioned. Yep. We start to get into that protection. I've built so much, I just got to protect what I've got. And we become less of a risk taker. But we also forget when we were 20. I was quite often called Bullet a Gate Benny when I was younger. It's because I just wanted to, conquer the world and take over everything, and I wanted to be 10 steps ahead where I was. I was so impatient. Whereas nowadays, I'm such the opposite to that. I'm so not cautious, but I'm very strategic in my thinking, and I research things and then I execute so differently to when I was young. Yeah. So I've quite often had conversations, especially with dads, about the younger sons coming through, for example, and they're like, they don't understand what's got into it, and they don't work as hard as me, and, they're making silly risks and they don't get it. And sometimes when you go back to dad and say, hey, remember what you were like when you were 20?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you did this. You were probably very similar, and you've just got to look at these kids with wonder, because that drive is not in every child, as you mentioned before. So if you've got a kid that's come back to the place and they're driven and they're motivated, I mean, you can't create that in the next generation. They've either got it or they haven't. And so if you've got it, you just need to nurture it, bend it, don't break it, I think is really, really important. And the other thing I just want to make the point of is, if you look at partnerships, someone said to me years ago, Andrew, they said, if you've got two people in partnership and they're exactly the same, why the bloody hell do you need two? Mm-hmm. And so when you've got a family business and you've got, say, siblings coming through and they're different, that can actually be gold in a business. Because if I had three Bens in a business, God help us, whereas if you've got three different people, there can be friction, but that's what a business needs, is that diversity of ideas, that diversity of responsibilities. You can't all be the same. And so mum and dad have to acknowledge that the next kids coming through will do things differently to them, just like they did things differently to their parents.
Mate, it's huge. And talking about, I don't have time to put values in place, this is why you do it, because it'll save a lot of friction, a lot of fighting. If everyone's in agreement with the values and everyone's like, yep, we're happy with that, then, and everyone agrees to play by them, then it's the glue. In my opinion, it glues everyone together, forms a team cohesion, which can become unstoppable. And you're absolutely right. You may not have completely avoid conflict, but you'll just open up the communication channels. And also the importance to realise as well, Ben, that values, you need to spend time and get to know what's important to them, because you might not have ever asked them. You might actually not really know what's important to your children, or what's important to your parents or your brother or your sister. So taking the time to find out And you've hit the nail on the head as well. It changes. Just to share this quick story with you, I did a walk on the Kokoda Trail and I wanted to conquer it in 4 days or something. Did it with Dad, and Dad said, no, we're going to do it slowly. And so we did it over like 8 or 9 days. But I was walking over there in Papua New Guinea and I was witnessing how happy the communities in the mountains were. They would knock off about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We're playing soccer. We'd sit down. They'd go out and get their own dinner and they'd all sit around and sing at night. And I was watching all of this and all of a sudden going, why aren't I doing this? I was working my bum off 70, 80 hours a week, running a successful company. And so I had a shift on this walk and if you like, an awareness that I want that life. I want a more of a community, slower, enjoyable life. But what I've created over here in Sydney is not a match for that. And so I made the decision on that walk to get out of that business that I own. I sold it.
Because you weren't living your values.
Well, I thought I was.
But you actually weren't.
No, but the walk opened me up to what was really important to me. This is important. And so I was miserable running the business in Sydney, very driven, and looking back on it, trying to look good to everyone else. You know, for me back then, it was an ego. It was, look at me, got the big office in Sydney, you know, making all this money. It was ridiculous. But underneath the cover, but I wasn't aware of it. I didn't even understand until I did the walk. I was miserable. Yeah, and it was only on that walk where I went, hang on, these things are important to me. Why aren't I doing these things that are for free? Why don't I have time for this? And that's when I asked myself that question, what the hell am I chasing? And so certain things in life, death's a big one.
Illnesses is another big one. Someone has a health scare.
Yeah. Or, you know, one of your children might have lost a close friend and that might have had a significant impact on what they value. And who am I to tell that person how to live their life based on their experiences, which is very different to mine? And this is this powerful thing that I've finally figured out, because I used to, when I first got into coaching, I used to try and coach every single family member and try to make them better and see where they were going wrong and get, you know, you should read this book. And now I've got older, I don't bother, because I've realised the only person that I can control is me and stay in my lane, because I have as many faults as everyone else. So I work on me for the benefit of others, but I don't go out of my way and force other people to work on them. But I will say, if I'm running a business, I want everyone in that business with what I call a growth mindset. I would never hire someone if they didn't have a growth mindset, which a growth mindset is just that a mindset where they're open and willing to change.
We have a value in our family called a can-do,
Yes.
which is basically when opportunity comes up, we have we can do rather than we can't.
Yes.
And that's been really valuable for our family throughout time, is because, especially with my daughter who's just about to turn 7, is when we've had adversity or something's come up, we've been able to lean back on that and say, well, remember, one of our values is can do. So can we fix this? Can we make this better? Can we take on this opportunity? And she'd go away and she'd think about it. She'd come back and she'd go, yeah, Dad, we can.
So that's powerful.
Yeah.
And so you sat down and defined values to govern your family.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So we did. So what I worked out is I see a lot of friction in families when there shouldn't be friction.
Yep.
And so a couple of things I've been through over my career that I've worked with families and I've seen a big impact was talking about values, so that you've got something to align to. Yep. And then, you know, when conflict comes up, you can go back to those values and say, okay, well, what's one of our family values? And it could be respect. Let's just say it's respect. And then bringing the family back to be able to say, hey, one of our number one values is respect. Are we acting respectfully right now? People go back to their corners, calm down. If it's truly their values, they then are more likely to come back. And the second one is about making decisions as well. So, for example, if you're a can-do family, you know, or a doer or a hard-working, well then, you know, when an opportunity comes up, you go back to your values. You know, can we make this work? Yeah. And then the second one is when families sit down and start talking about generational aspirations. And that's been one of the most powerful ones I've ever seen in a room, Andrew, is when you sit down with the two generations, you know, mum and dad and the kids or some of the kids, and you sit in a room and you go, well, mum and dad, what do you want? You know, and you know, they'll come up with the first things, you know, the very surface stuff. But when you start digging down and they start saying things like, you know, we've built this up, we don't want to lose it, we want our grandkids to do well, our kids, we want to give opportunity. And then all of a sudden the kids sit around and go, holy shit, Dad, I've never heard you say that before. Really? Yeah. Is that what you want? So when you start talking about those values and aspirations, people start to open up more and it builds the connection. Yeah. Same as on the younger generation. You know, they might have kids that have gone off to boarding school or uni and they're partying and having a great time. And then all of a sudden we talk about, well, what do you want out of your life, young lady or young man? And they say, oh, look, I really want to build something. I've seen how hard mum and dad work. When I'm ready, I want to take on the responsibility. And mum and dad look over and go, who is this person? You know, we've been worried that they're lost. And so having discussions about what your generational aspirations are for yourself and for other generations is incredibly powerful as well for families.
Mate, it's so important. And what you've just shared it's the glue. It's what you come back to. As you said, if there's chaos or if there's something going wrong, you come back to that. And it's something to lean on, I feel. It's solid. And they can change over time as well in a family dynamic, but the ones we put in place at Farm Owners have been the same the whole way through. They don't need to change. It's just they're locked in. Everyone's linked up to them. Every 90 days we go over them and we find examples of where people are living those values. During everyone gets reviewed every 6 months, and every single review we go through the values and we give them a rating out of 100. How aligned are you to that value? If it's under 80 out of 100, there's an opportunity to help them learn more. But it's just something to come back to. It's very powerful.
It is. And so because I've spent all my working career working in either a coaching type role or financial advisor, I like numbers and statistics and maths. That's my thing. I like to have data when it comes to making decisions. And the thing I've always found difficult, and when I tell people this, it really sets the alarm bells off in them, how important values are. Because you know how you said it's a bit wishy-washy and, you know, it's, you know, most people sit there and go, oh, you know, it's a like to do, not a want to do.
Yes.
And I go back and say there was some research came out of the US about 10 to 15 years ago. So it's a little bit old, but it was a large-scale research project where they actually went out and essentially analysed about 3,500 wealthy families. And what they worked out was about 70% of the wealth transfers, so that's transitioning the family business normally from one generation to the next, about 70% of the time it failed.
Wow.
So that's almost, you know, essentially 2/3. 2 out of 3 is going to fail. And if you look in the farming game, that's probably pretty right. And that's the old reflection of the 2 generations to make it, 1 to lose it.
Yes.
Now, the interesting part is they worked this out and they figured out it was pretty much stock standard across all geographical areas, all demographics, all industries. It was the same. And it was about that. Now, where the important part is they then went through and said, well, why the bloody hell is that happening? And the first thing most people thought was, well, it must be bad advice. You know, lawyers have set things up wrong, accountants, etc. And it was only about 3% of the time it was caused by bad professional advice. Okay. Now, the interesting part is 60% of the reasons it's failed was because of a lack of communication and a breakdown in trust. And so 60%, which is unbelievable. Wow. I think it was, the next thing was 25% of the reason was because of a failure to prepare the heirs, so the next generation to take over. So they hadn't been adequately prepared. And 12% was caused by not having a family mission, you know, a focus on where we want to go. And so essentially 97% of the reasons these transfers fail from generation to generation, and we can say succession plans fail, is well within your control. And the major one is communication. And so when families start sitting down and talking about values and talking about things that aren't just about when are we mustering that paddock, which bull are we going to buy, what crop we're going to plant this year, it starts to improve the communication in the family. And so I personally believe, and anecdotally have noticed, as soon as you start families talking about starting to want to improve their communication, a conversation around the rules of the family and the values that we have is a bloody good step and is an absolutely amazing foundation for starting to avoid those communication issues and trust breakdown.
It's huge. What was it, 60%? Because of, trust.
Bad communication and a breakdown of trust.
Yeah.
And trust is the major one. And trust is broken when values are violated. So, for example, if you believe in honesty, and your family members you don't believe are being honest or hard work, that's where resentment kicks in. That's where trust. And so for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. The stats show if you're not looking at values, you're not looking at the mission of the family, you're not improving your communication, mate, you're pushing shit uphill with a toothpick.
It's just huge. It's huge. And as I said, slowing down to get this stuff in place, slow down in order to speed up. It would make the biggest difference. But even just looking at that trust, there's a fantastic book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and Why Teams Don't Work. And the underlying issue is trust. And he defines trust as knowing that your peers can be themselves and not have any worry about being judged or, they can show up, they can be themselves, they communicate openly. If something's going on, they'll share it, right? So you've just hit the nail on the head. And the only way to build trust is communication. You can't get trust without communication. And so a lot of family farms particularly struggle with this because they haven't created what I would say is booked time to communicate. They might wing it on the fly, but I think you've got to become a little bit more proactive about this and allocate time where the gates are open to communicate, where you actually get to understand what's really going on. 3 of the most powerful words: help me understand. Trying to understand that person. It's so important, communication, and putting some form of rhythm in. This is what I'm a big fan of. The Rockefeller habits, which is annual planning and then quarterly planning and then a weekly meeting. Putting in a structure that once you've got the values and everything in place, that you put a structure in place to come back and realign to those values. I mean, I think it's so healthy every year checking in. How are you going? Has anything changed? And because people do change. Someone might have had a kid or something might have happened. But yeah, if you keep those communication channels open, it will fuel trust. But the way to get trust is to ensure that there's a healthy enough environment that I can rock up to work and share with you if I've got a problem at home. So I know that my peers' intentions are good, that I can be honest with you. Because there's probably a lot of siblings that are not really sharing what's really going on. And they might be out on the paddock and they might be pissed off with something, right, that happened back at home. And then that sibling gets annoyed with them because they're angry, And so this whole thing blows up. But if there was just good communication, then a lot of these things can be ironed out. You've got to treat it like a relationship.
Absolutely. And look, hiding your feelings or hiding your anger or resentment or bitterness isn't good communication.
No.
A lot of families make the mistake where they go, oh, we all get on beautifully well and we all sit in the kitchen table, but nobody talks about the elephants in the room. They just brush over it. And I always say that's just repressing any emotions that are in there. And eventually you'll repress it, and then eventually it comes out with a chainsaw and you end up with a Texas chainsaw massacre within the family. So communication for me is absolutely important. And look, my analogy with people is successful producers are always looking at how can we do things better? How can we expand our footprint? Should we buy the neighbour's property? They're really driven to do better, but it's all for naught if you're one of the 70% that the wealth transfers fail.
Yeah.
Because the same stat showed that within 3 generations, 90% of the wealth was gone.
Fascinating.
90%. So you're just busting your ass all day trying to say, okay, we're trying to pay off some debt, get more breeders, buy another block, expand. Well, if you fall into that trap and within 3 generations the wealth's gone, well, what's the bloody good of it? Don't you want to retain that wealth? Because it's great to build it, but if you don't retain it across the generations, what a waste of your life.
Yeah.
What of a lace. So why not invest some of that time into aligning the family, working out the mission, getting the communication better? That's going to give you a far better foundation to start off from than it ever's going to be, fixing that back fence or repairing a poly pipe or something like that.
Huge. And realising that you're right, putting this stuff in place, you could maybe keep that going for decades, that transfer of wealth, and possibly having it built. So who knows? But I would say you got a significant high probability by doing this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the stats show it. That 97% is within your control to make sure you don't fall into the the trap, there's only 3% that isn't.
Yeah.
And so that's the really heartening part. And, here's a little bit of just one, because we're getting close to the end of our time now, Andrew, which I could talk about this for 2 days, as everyone can probably tell. But I remember one of the times in my career where I was incredibly proud of something that happened. And I had a young man that I think is, he's grown up, he's got a great work ethic, good values, off farm, working for a while, and wants to do well, but just hasn't learnt the skills of communication. He's young, he's in his early 20s, he hasn't learned how to communicate. And I had a conversation with him one day, and he said, I'm really worried I need to have a conversation with mum and dad. And it was an amazing conversation. I was like, this kid's 21-year-old and he's going to have this conversation with his mum and dad. I wish I thought like this, but he just didn't know how to do it. He was essentially not petrified, but he's really worried and avoiding it. And so I sat down for probably half an hour with him and just listened, helped me understand what the problem is, gave him a few little tips on how to approach it with mum and dad, because mum and dad are great people. They're absolutely fabulous people. And the conversation went ahead and everyone was just amazed. And this whole issue just vanished really, really quickly. And so it doesn't have to mean, the point I'm probably making, Andrew, is, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, is learning to communicate as a family and tackle these problems doesn't have to mean wholesale changes as to who you are and how you do things. Sometimes it can just be some small tweaks in the way you approach things, mindset changes and communication. The language you use and the way you pitch your ideas can make a big, big difference to it. And I think if you can do that and you can go into the conversations with the next generation coming through with a really open mind and saying, what was it you said? I think, help me understand. Yeah. I think the world will be a much better place.
I mean, what you just said, the fear of being vulnerable, the fear of sharing what I want for fear of being judged, or I shouldn't be asking that. How much is that going on in farming families where stuff that needs to be said is not being said? So if everyone had that opportunity to share, which starts from someone asking the question, hey, help me understand, what do you want? What drives you? What motivates you? Where do you want to be in the next 5 years? If everyone had that chance to share what's really going on, and then to realize that a great business exists to help each person involved get what they want. I would have thought that's the ultimate succession is, how does this business help each person ultimately get what they want? But hey, you've got to firstly ask them, what do you want? If you don't.
Yeah. And you've got to be willing to accept the honesty when it comes back and you're not liking to hear it.
And to particularly not say, you should be more like me, or because that's the hard bit. It's like, hang on a second, this person's different to me. And to be accepting of that and to realize that's, and this is a big learning for me. Fortunately, I did get it quite early on, but it took me about 5 years of coaching. I just went, wow, not everyone's like me. Oh, wow. Because I just used to always think that, I don't know what it was. Was it an arrogance or something that I picked up that
No, but I think, because I'm very much the same. Like I'm a particularly driven sort of a bloke, and I would consider myself a bit of a rugged individualist. I do everything myself. I think that's probably growing up on the farm, what my dad taught me. But I was the same. I mean, when I would see people who weren't as driven as me, my natural instinct when I was younger was to go, they're lazy.
Yeah, me too.
And my sister, who's listening, I'm sure she'll be listening, one of my sisters is the complete opposite of me. And as I've got older in life, I've come to realise that, I always used to look and think, you've gone to uni, there's so much opportunity you could be doing. And she was just happy living her life. Yep. And now I look back and go, well, sometimes I wonder who's happier. Yeah. the person that's living the life they want to live, or the one that's forcing themselves into something that they don't necessarily want to do for a fear of looking bad. Yep. Or an obligation, a family obligation. I'm coming and I'm like this and I'm showing these traits because I feel like I have to.
Yeah. I mean, just imagine a kid that's doing everything just to impress and get mum and dad's approval, and they're still doing that at 50. And then when mum and dad eventually die and they're still living a life that's not true to them, is that what a parent really wants for their kid? Because the kids have an incredible ability to understand what's important for them. And if they're not happy, it's often because they're not in alignment to what they value. It's often what causes unhappiness is when we're not actually in true alignment to what we truly value. And often you get that big realization. It's like, wow, I'm just not spending enough time doing this. Or some people are creative, or some people just need travel. Some people I got a mate that just gets such a kick out of buying flash cars. But who's to anyone judging it? Everyone's so different. There's no right or wrong. It's been a big lesson for me. That's what makes the world wonderful. Everyone's slightly different.
It does. Yeah, I agree. Well, look, as I said, we could talk about this all day, I'm sure. Now, mate, before we wind up, would you have any recommendations for any books or anything like this to start to read or talk around values and mission and things like that for a family?
Look, I feel the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is such a brilliant book to really get clarity on nailing the communication, nailing the trust. And I will also just drop in here the 5 dysfunctions of a team is one of the best books because you actually learn, here's the 5 things to avoid that causes a team. And I'm just coming back to that statistics you shared at the end. I've got to get a copy of that because if most of these things aren't working and 60% of it's because of communication, then you can't get 2 better books, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and 5 Dysfunctions of a Team to get those things right.
Yeah. And the old analogy is with these statistics is if you put a bull out with your cows and 60% of the reason that you're not getting a high pregnancy rate or a pregnancy testing rate is because you didn't give the bull a bale of hay before it went out, you'd be a nut job not to give it a bale of hay before it went out, wouldn't you? And so that's as simple as I see this. It's just a no-brainer. That's where you should be focusing your time. So awesome. Excellent, Andrew. Well, look, where can people find more about you online?
Look, I'm still involved with Farm Owners Academy, so that's where the focus is. And anyone that's outside of agriculture or not in farming, andrewroberts.com.au. But yeah, mate, love doing this and love helping farmers and people in the ag space.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much for your time. I know everyone will have got a lot out of this today. I did as well. And yeah, look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Ben.
So if you're enjoying the podcast, please share it with your family and friends. Give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and help us share the wealth and wisdom. My name's Ben Law and I'm the Financial Bloke, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.